Alors on le sait, je dirais vous.
We all know it. You have been living through this pandemic. It has profoundly changed the workplace. It has redefined decision-taking processes, made some practices more autonomous. It made more complex the identification of associated occupational risks. And the way this hybridization will evolve in the future poses questions to prevention, compensation, and reparation professionals. So what can we say about this period? What about the hybrid company of the future? And what about the management of associated occupational risks? Let us start with our speakers. First, Ivailo, KALFIN. Good morning. You were a minister in Bulgaria twice, Minister of Employment, MEP, and today you are the Executive Director of the European Foundation for the Improvement of Living and Working Conditions, Eurofound. And it's the first time that Eurofound is here with us at EUROGIP. Thank you for being here, and it's one of the oldest European agencies. It's a tripartite agency between the state, the employees, and employers. It's a very active research institution. There are about 50 ongoing projects plus 30 publications, and you were incredibly active during the pandemic. You carried out studies on the evolution of working conditions and workers' perception of these changes. Then Maxime BELLEGO, good morning to you. You already visited us a couple of years ago. You have a PhD in psychology. You are a clinical psychologist in the city of Toulon, and you're also a professor. And you wrote this recently published book, Work is Sick, It Makes Us Suffer. And we are going to see how today work can make us sick. And I think you are well versed in this topic because this is what you address in your occupation as a clinical psychologist. You listen to employees who suffer at work, but you also work in companies. You also were involved in the famous France Telecom case, and you were working on company organizations evolution, how they can adapt to this new way of working. And now, Marc MALENFER, you are the director of the INRS Monitoring and Prospects Department. And in your department, you work on nano-robots, platformization, circular economy, and many other topics. You adopt a pluridisciplinary approach, and you analyze the possible future through various scenarios. And with your partner, Futurable, you analyze the future ways of working in the post-pandemic world. You analyzed also how health and safety issues are going to be managed. Now let me switch to English, Ivailo, even though you have a perfect command of French.
I would like to start with you. I said Eurofound conducted during the pandemic different and quite many studies regarding the evolution of the work condition, the way workers lived this period, and the way the organization and the environment of work changed. I would like to review with you some of the main Eurofound data on the impact of the crisis, and EUROGIP actually did relate some of these data. Let's start with the impact of the pandemic itself on the mental well-being of the workers. How was this mental well-being affected during the crisis, and who were the persons most exposed?
First, thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you to EUROGIP for the invitation. And I would like to say that Eurofound started research in the spring of 2020. So for the 2 last years, we have an evolving and recurring survey of what is happening across Europe. We had 5 waves of this survey already. Meanwhile, we started others. So we have quite a good picture about what happens across the EU member states. And the picture is pretty clear. I'll show you some slides on that. You see how the compared to the World Health Organization mental well-being scale from 0 to 100, what was the mental well-being of European citizens during the pandemic. Before the pandemic, this is the last column, it was 64%. Then it decreased dramatically. Mostly, I mean, the longer the pandemic lasts, the most decrease of the mental well-being of the citizens. Then we have a difference by countries, but more or less these are average figures for Europe. I would say that in most of the countries we see the same tendencies. Then if we look at the type of employment and the mental well-being, we see that, of course, the effect is most visible with the unemployed people. Quite considerably, I mean, the important that the students and we are going to see young people are particularly affected by the pandemic, with all this sense of insecurity, starting their professional career, etc., etc. By sector, of course, the most affected sectors were the ones that had to close down during the lockdowns. I mean, this is the retail and hospitality, the education sector. Health sector was fighting. I mean, they were on the first line of the pandemic. That's why they were very much motivated. But again, we see this across the sectors also. Here we are asking in the surveys 3 questions. How do you feel in terms of feeling depressed, lonely, or tense? And here the first column is data we had from before the pandemic, from 2016. So a few years before the pandemic. If you compare the first and the last column, you see how much the feeling of depression, the feeling of loneliness, and the feeling of feeling tense is increasing during the pandemic 5 times in some cases, which is extremely high, showing this. The effect on the mental well-being of people is different, varying by gender and by age groups. We see that in general the pandemic affected more the psychosocial risks of young people and of women. And there is a good explanation in that. I mean, if we go behind these figures, we are going to see why it happens. But the fact is that indeed, yes, young people and women are much more affected in terms of psychosocial comfort and psychosocial risks on that. Also, families with children, also understandably, schools were closed, kindergartens were closed, families had to arrange their life in a totally new way, caring about the children, continuing being at work, etc., etc. And again, we see that we have more effect on the women than on the men, which is also explained by the huge amount of so-called unpaid work that women carry out. I mean, everything related to care of children, homework, etc., etc. This is usually times above the men engagement. So women are much more stressed putting together all these things. So these are the major findings. Of course, these figures have a very good explanation. We could go into further details, but I would stop here for this.
There's another one, if we go on, which is quite interesting. It's the impact of this non-pharmaceutical intervention on mental health. What does it? What are the main point which has the major impact, actually?
You see, I mean, the vertical line is the current status of the mental well-being. Everything to the left of the vertical line is increased risk or people feeling worse with that. On the right side, this is supporting the decisions. And we see that the big effect on the mental well-being was caused by the impossibility to travel, impossibility to socialize, the impossibility to gather together with friends and indeed socialized. Also the contract tracking. I mean, at the beginning there were, you remember all these apps that show you where exactly you are in the space, which was kind of a depressive for many people. On the other hand, I think there was a very positive positive acceptance by the people of the closures of the workplace. I mean, this is where people felt most insecure going to work. So closing workplaces was considered personally a positive fact. But we also see some positive assessment of the public events, decrease of the possibilities for that, the closure of transports, etc., everything which makes everybody feel safer. So there was this paradox. You have to stay in the family. You agree that you shouldn't go to work. You agree that you shouldn't socialize. But at the same time, you feel much more stressed and much more insecure because you don't know how this is going to develop, how you are going to progress in your career, whether your company is going to be alive at all after this whole pandemic. So the levels of stress increased very much.
This is really it's a bit of the new deal of the situation. It's on one way it's not so good, and on the other way it's really wished and quite good actually. So they wish for they're okay and they feel really more well-being with the fact that the workplace closed, but then they have to telework. And then you also try to look at the effect of telework. And even though they were happy not to go to the office, they might not all have been so happy to telework, or at least they might have big impacts that you really try to value. Let's see exactly the effect of telework as you could evaluate them.
You're absolutely right. I mean, we have to put teleworking in the pandemic in the context of overall feeling of insecurity. So this overall atmosphere, of course, influenced the mental well-being. We cannot take only telework and say this is the reason only. So that's the whole context, and then we go to telework. I have to start by saying that telework is here to stay. I mean, employers, workers, society is interested in that. It gives many positive opportunities for people, but at the same time it has setbacks. And if these setbacks are not addressed, then teleworking risks to be very much a risk for everybody. Here, this is a preliminary results from a study that we carried over the last year, a massive study across the European Union. It shows what is the status of people mostly working self-employed in the premises of the employer or from home. During the pandemic, we have measured if before the pandemic there were about 5-6% of the jobs that were done remotely. During the pandemic, they peaked to 39% at some point of the lockdown. So from 6 to 39 people working from abroad. Then the average during the pandemic was about 22-25% of the jobs being done remotely. Not all the jobs can be done remotely. We also made this calculation. About 1/3 of the jobs theoretically could be done remotely, but for the others you need a presence.
To the workplace.
And actually what we see is that teleworking turns from a necessity during the lockdown into a privilege, because we see that 80% of those that experience teleworking want to keep it in a form, I mean mostly hybrid form, to have the possibility to go to the office but also to work from home. But let's see how the telework affected the workers. Again, the feelings of anxiety, physical exhaustion, and backache. The first column, if they work in employers' premises or own businesses. Then, if it is hybrid, the middle column, and the third one, if they work from home. So we see that working from home increases anxiety. Maybe people feel less physical exhaustion, and it doesn't change very much the situation with musculoskeletal risks and ergonomic conditions. The health concerns of work, working while sick. There is a tendency to work more when you are sick if you are working from the premises of the employer. So if you have to go to the premises, you tend to go even if you don't feel healthy enough. If you stay at home, there are better chances that you take care of your health first and then go further. With the working time, there is something that is seen for many already researchers. Working from home means long hours of work. And this is reported by, if normal, I'll give you a figure which is not here, but if people working from the premises of the employers, about 19% of them say they are working overtime. At home, this is doubled. This is close to 40% people working from home saying they're working longer hours, of course, like having less free time. The work intensity basically doesn't change very much, but the working intensity, if you are to commute and to have a hybrid type of work, is high. By the way, work intensity with teleworking is increasing as a whole, because otherwise, if you are moving from one meeting to another, from one room to another, etc., you have some time to concentrate, to recover. Now you switch between meetings online. Some people are doing what they call multitasking, looking at the meeting, reading a text, writing something on the other side.
Two emails, one Zoom, and
exactly,
and the children.
The intensity is very high. You can do it for some time, but do it for all the time, that is exhausting. I mean, that's clearly there. The autonomy, of course, people working at home feel more autonomous, and this is the most important argument for people to prefer to stay at home, because that gives them a better chance to manage the time, to spare some time from commuting, to take care of dependent members of the family, children, elderly people, etc., etc. So working from home is a clear preference because of the autonomy that people have. The social support from managers, and this is very important to see, and the social support from colleagues. It is the less from colleagues, of course, when you are working at home. And this is also one of the expressions of the feeling of loneliness. I mean, when we are working from home, you kind of start losing the contact with the others, and you start concentrating on your own work. Without having a broader picture of the organization, without having the social contact with the colleagues. So you feel much less supported, you feel much more focused on what is your immediate tasks, and you kind of lose the whole picture of plus initiatives, innovation, etc., that you might have. The trust issue, again, if you trust that if you are working from home, actually, I mean, you can see here we show that management trusts their employees to work well if they're working from home. That has to be the case. But I see, lastly, that in many instances, I mean, employers are asking the employees to return to the offices. Mainly, this is due to a huge pressure which is on the managerial level. I mean, this is working hybrid or from home is a huge strain on the management. That's a totally new type of management. Not the one that we know that everybody is in the office and you tend to manage that one. Feeling work well done or having useful work, something which is very important in terms of seeing how useful you are. Again, when working from home, you start having the feeling that you are not sure if your job is so much useful. I mean, you do it properly, but you use the picture, I mean, where it falls into the whole activity of the company, which is also an issue that needs to be addressed. So these are some major findings, again, of teleworking.
Maybe because it's very interesting to get this global picture, and you're from the one who can give us this global picture of the time we went through, and the time we will still go on for the years to come, because hybrid work is going to be the way it's going to be happening for a lot of persons. Out of these figures, actually, and due to the fact that it's going to be ongoing for a lot of workers, because 80% want it to go on. What might be the 2 or 3 lessons you would take out of this data in order to help to have really secure workplace in this hybrid configuration we will go to?
First, I think, first lesson is that the pandemic was a catalyzer and hybrid work and telework is here to stay. I mean, there is lots of interest invested, so it's going to be there. Maybe there will be a decrease, that's normal, but it's going to be at much higher level than the pre-pandemic, and it's going to increase in the future. Second, it gives plenty of opportunities. What needs to be addressed, these issues. I mean, how the longer working hours are addressed, how the legislation in terms of control on the ergonomic working conditions. I mean, it's very difficult, not to say impossible, for the employer to guarantee that at home you have enough light, air quality, a separate room where you can work without income, etc., etc. So this needs to be addressed. You cannot give responsibilities if they cannot be carried, and it is very important. I mean, this is a totally new type of management. I mean, indeed, the big strain goes to the management. I mean, managers I think they need to be supportive for the hybrid work, but that's a very different kind of management. I mean, you first need to make the people feel that they're doing a very good job, that they need to feel the whole picture. They need to feel how their job is entering the whole work of the unit, of the entity, and then you need to increase this feeling of support, both from colleagues and from the manager. So with the hybrid work, it means a very different managerial methods. And of course, the last thing, we are a tripartite organization very much involved in social dialogue. It creates a number of issues for the social partners to address. I mean, how that's the best way if workers and employers sit together and decide where are the setbacks and what could be done in order to arrange them. France is a very good example. I mean, France has a legislation for the right to disconnect, the first in Europe since 2016, much before the pandemic. Now everybody speaks about the right to disconnect, and across Europe you have either pieces of legislation or ideas to go to that. So this is a good example how social partners have to sit together, and legislators have to give them the room to negotiate. But it's a totally new type of work, and we shouldn't have the mistake that we come back to the normal as we were before the pandemic.
We will speak about these negotiations, these regulations, of course. Merci beaucoup, Ivailo. Je voudrais qu'on reviendra sur un peu les commentaires que vous...
Thank you very much, Ivailo, and welcome back to you for more comments. These are very interesting issues. Do not hesitate to ask questions or make some comments on what has just been presented. Now, I'd like to go to your take on this, Marc MALENFER, and give us the bigger. We've just heard the bigger picture on how people felt during these 2 years, but you conducted a piece of work telling us what the working organizations are going to look like at the end of this period. So there were 2 stages in the pandemic. For your work on the pandemic, you worked with EUROGIP, with some 15 large companies, to try and understand what sort of trends are going to prevail in the coming years, like a conventional scenario. But the INRS looked at what could be the situation for occupational risks with other stakeholders to try and see how these new organizations are going to impact the workplace. Apparently, 5 large trends are going to be seen as changes in the organizations. Digitization is one thing, but it's not the only one. Rather than trends, we rather refer to challenges. We don't know at all what tomorrow is going to look like. So we try and explore possible future scenarios and identify the levers that can be determining. And so we wanted to highlight the changes in the workplace that might call the attention of the health and safety stakeholders. And there are 5 challenges that are closely intertwined with one another, and some of them have already been mentioned. Firstly, the extended recourse to new technologies, information and communications technologies, and the various challenges we identified were already present before the pandemic. But it sort of was sped up, and the pandemic was a catalyst. And more particularly, the fact that people resort more and more to these new technologies, including in the industry, for instance. The second point, which is very much associated with that, is the obvious will in companies to become more nimble, more agile. Some of them have become more aware of their vulnerabilities, particularly with regard to the supply chain, and also employee shortages. They've tried to identify levers to make them more nimble and more flexible and more likely to adapt to the market and the various situations they're going to be faced with. And thirdly, third challenge is the use of more non-conventional form of work. Of course, long-term contracts, labor contracts, remain the prevailing form of work organization in France, but there's an increasing number of self-employed workers. Fourthly, how can these companies, how can the businesses maintain this collective approach to work? We know that the collective approach to health and safety is very important, because this is what gives you the most relevant solutions. So one may wonder about the capacity for businesses to maintain their coherence and their capacity to make sure that there is a forum in the company to discuss upon these safety and health issues. And there are also so many new stakeholders now, the prime contractors, the subcontractors, there are so many new interfaces, and all these interfaces could be associated with risks unless the stakeholders are properly coordinated. So this is what you refer to as multiple activities, so much so that you find it a bit difficult to know who's in charge of what and who does what. Now, you gave us a broad overview of the various industries. However, 50% of people who work in offices or in workshops or in work sites, well, these people in the work sites, in the plants, in the factories, were not affected by teleworking. Could they be affected by these changes? Yes, indeed, and more particularly the fact that there is now e-commerce, which has boomed during the pandemic. E-commerce is an attempt to try and align the physical world on the acceleration of things due to digitization of the various processes of purchases, for instance, payments. All this, of course, means that the working conditions of workers become invisible with more and more musculoskeletal disorders, road traffic accidents that are on the upward trend. Yes, and automation also plays a role in that. What is very impressive here is the way you've looked at all that and everything which has been deployed, all these computers, things that can enable us to organize meetings such as Zoom, but it can be something which is detrimental, but it can also be something positive. So it's always two-faced. And you said so. It becomes increasingly difficult to measure exactly what is likely to be a source of occupational risk, because exactly the same thing could become problematic in some situations or positive in other situations. So there are these gray areas, according to you, due to coactivity, and because also the roles and responsibilities are no longer clearly identified. And this is in this sort of environment, not the greatest number of problems could be seen. Do you think that we should be wary of these all these changes and these new tools? Well, you see, it all depends on what you do with these new instruments and these new digital technologies. However, relying on technology is something which is part and parcel of the general principles to guarantee health and safety. You should try and take ownership of these new tools in order to try and improve the working conditions and protect the workers more efficiently. That's my first point. Secondly, one should not become carried away by these potential benefits of these technologies. We shouldn't lose sight of the risks entailed by resorting to these new technologies, i.e. Seeing a wider gap between the procedures, because of course procedures can be entered in a laptop very easily. However, in real life things never happen the way that is expected. So in the way we use these new technologies, we should try to make sure that the employees, the workers, are involved in the use of these new technologies, so that we come up with tools that are not just prescriptive tools, that are disconnected from the real life situations. And there's yet another challenge which you focus on, i.e. the place of risk prevention stakeholders, risk prevention players, and what their role could be. And you say, and I quote, they're going to be increasingly faced with complex systems and also in environments where the roles and responsibilities may not be clearly defined, and with working collectivity that are more and more ephemeral and distributed and scattered across the world. So you can no longer say or tell whom you are talking to and what the risks are. So what could be the strategies for preventers in these new environments? Because you no longer know whether the person you're talking to is someone from the company or someone who is a subcontractor, someone who is a third party. Now, this is a potential, this is a possible scenario for the future, but this is unfortunately so not the usual situation in which employees find themselves nowadays. But it's true that the increasing resort to new technologies makes it very difficult for preventers and risk prevention actors to get access to levers that can help them to modify these tools, like a company that buys new software that radically change the organization of work. Once the situation deteriorates, it's very difficult to try and argue with the company that they should change the software because it's bad for workers' health. They paid millions for it and are not very ready to do so. So we have to try and be involved as upstream as possible for risk prevention. And I think we need to raise our skills and competences. For what? For the proper understanding of these tools, but also for proper understanding of what risk prevention means. For prevention players, I think we need to see them be more on top of the job about all these tools to offer better pieces of advice to companies, and also make sure that discussions can be held in a valuable way. And we need also to make sure that the people who design these tools and who design these new working conditions, we need to raise their awareness with regard to psychosocial risks, to organizational factors, and so on and so forth, so that these tools, we must make sure that these tools are not designed without taking into account employees' health right from the design stage. Yes, indeed, and make sure that we accompany empowerment, because these people, the employees, are more and more empowered and autonomous thanks to these new tools, but we need to accompany that, yes, indeed, and we need also to find levers that can help people, the designers, to get feedback from real-life working environment so that they can take into account their various requirements and constraints. Maxime BELLEGO, let me come to you now. We're going to refer to your book. And what about your clinical practice and your take on what Ivailo has just told us on mental health and people feeling isolated and overworked and overwhelmed by working from home situations? So what did they tell you in your clinical practice and in the various companies you work with as well? I think that all that has been said explains how anxiety can be through the roof, can go through the roof when you work from home, but people who are not tired at all, and so people become sleepless, and just for a few days it's not a problem, but if you do that for months on end, it can become very difficult. And this is exactly what my patients tell me and told me. How can you, they ask me, how can I organize myself? I'm all alone, on my own. And I'm no longer in contact with my colleagues. I no longer talk to them at the coffee machine. I don't go from one meeting to the next. But now I go from one meeting to the next on my own, and I'm alone in front of my laptop. And so this change of scenery, when you have to get dressed, you have to catch a bus or a train, these are very important moments in your day, because you start projecting yourself in your day, whereas if you stay at home, you don't get this sort of transition. You just get up. And if no one is going to see you, well, you can just, not get dressed at all, just not get ready, not groom not groom at all, and you start doing multiple tasks. And it's something which is absolutely exhausting. And you can't do that when you work. Multitasking is something that is not very efficient. And additionally, people feel really at loss. So these moments of regeneration to give some thought to something else, and also this change of scenery. A change is as good as a rest, and even if we didn't pay attention to it, it's something which is very important. What about your Eurofound and INRS work? Because it does resonate with your book. On the basis of your experience, your clinical practice, and your work in companies, you analyze how people complain about work. And we tend to think that, or to have a political take on this, we think that, well, the company in itself is something which is toxic, or that there are some elements in the company, people who are narcissistic and who are toxic. But you're saying that it's not that. It's just that people feel that the horizon is uncertain, and they become isolated, and they become prey to people, managers who are going to harass them, call them several times per day, and gradually the person who is now alone at home has no one to turn to get some support. So this new environment where we have co-activity, where you don't know who is in charge of what, who is the manager, who belongs to the company, who is just a third party, who is just self-employed, it does complexify the situation even further, and it can really worsen the situations described in your book. So, what would be your reaction to what our two speakers have just said? It's very interesting. And more particularly, this feeling of uncertainty and the lack of social support. This is the greatest, the situation with the highest level of risk, according to all psychosocial scenarios. People become very vulnerable. And of course, there are still, of course, people who are harassed in organizations, but also on top of that, organizations don't work well, are not properly organized. There's no common sense here. For instance, like it was just said, first invest and design the software, but don't talk to employees, and then implement the software, and then realize that it's not really doing what it's supposed to do. And this is something which does make the person feel vulnerable, and it does lead to unstable structures in the companies. Now, if you're at home and your setting is a quiet one, of course, not just if you're in a large house on the coastline, but if you're just a flat where you feel at ease, and who can disconnect from all this and say, well, from 3 to 4 p.m., I'm going to stop. I just stop. I'm going to walk for an hour. And too bad if it's not good as far as the managerial control is concerned, but it's better for the person to just leave it there and go out instead of feeling trapped in a mission so impossible that the person could be put at risk, or her or his health could be put at risk. What about your intervention when there are serious problems in a company? How can we include these rituals and this empowerment? Otherwise, the risk is to see that there's going to be an added demand for more reporting, more feedback from managers. So how can we raise the awareness of managers? Now, work organizations in some cases are fairly innovative and flexible, and implement a fair control of the activity. And for these organizations, teleworking isn't a problem. However, in other companies, in other organizations where there is a tendency to be a control freak, this is, of course, very difficult, and everything tumbles down because remote controlling people is faced with limitations, and unless your manager, your line manager, or your supervisor come and check on you at your home, there are things that can't be done remotely. And you've seen some softwares, I'm sure, that can measure the movements of the mouse to make sure that the teleworker is actually working. And so some people putting their mouse in a computer mouse on the automated vacuum cleaner to make sure that it moves a bit more actively. And all this can lead in these organizations to a sort of control paranoia. And then people may become very ill. However, this is not people becoming ill. Some people become ill. Doesn't jeopardize the organization, but good, efficient employees leaving the organization could disrupt the whole system. So you act as a consultant in various organizations, so you listen to people. And so you listen to people. What could be the role of preventers in this new hybrid environment? And do you share Marc MALENFER's view? Yes, indeed. And I think the preventer should be the closest, or the support that is closest is at hand for people, because we've seen that managers can be over-controlling or not sufficiently supportive, but preventers can be really the ones that can be very close to people. Like I have an anecdote here. After the major crisis at France Telecom, the company was was doing better, and they were introducing new softwares, but they always had a pilot phase, experimental phase, with the various working groups giving their feedback about the good points or the negative points, and therefore at the end of this experimental phase, they either decided at France Telecom to retain the new solution or just get rid of it or not implement it at all. And I think it's just a bit of common sense. This is the biggest problem these days is the amount of work, and people are trapped into this attempt to do more and more. So new working groups for teleworking, it seems to be quite difficult to organize. For working groups to work well, you need to be face-to-face. And however, for in technical environments, also in technical environment, people need to be able to actually lay their hands on things. Otherwise, it's not possible for them to judge and to give a feedback. And so preventers, when they work on the organizational models and tools, as Marc said, that's one thing, but there are also individual situations, and so things are going to be increasingly difficult to understand. So, and these individual situations are going to be increasingly different and difficult to understand. So, this management of risks and risk prevention, do you think it's going to become hybrid as well? So there's going to be a hybridization of doctrines and work organization, but also some support from people like you, clinical psychologists, to support managers and help them to do their jobs. Now, of course, managers have to take care of their team's health, mental health, but they can't just be. They are not in a situation to do so. So I think we need to make the link between prevention and health at the workplace. So I think we need to organize an assessment much more regularly than in the past. Occupational physicians were seen only once in a while. So it may be now, with this new situation, to implement something that is more regular, i.e. a quarterly discussion with a preventer or with a psychologist, or and then with supervision, with oversight of the managers by someone who is specialized in, like a psychologist. But I think this new situation offers us an opportunity to move forward and to do better. Thank you very much, and thank you to all of you. Marc, Ivailo, and Maxime, to have shared with us your thoughts and your work. Maxime BELLEGO's book, very interesting book. The work is sick and work makes us suffer. We're going to have a short break now, and we're going to see how we can we can do something about all this through insurance with stakeholders from various European countries. Thank you.